The moment Caitlin Clark made her stance clear, everything around the Indiana Fever started to shift, and not in a good way. Now tensions are rising and players are beginning to push back. What's unfolding in Indianapolis isn't some controlled PR narrative from the front office or a carefully scripted media rollout. This is something far more raw. Frustrated players are taking matters into their own hands, speaking out and shaping the conversation themselves. Behind the scenes, the locker room appears to be under serious strain. The pressure of the salary cap, contract decisions, and roster priorities is creating visible cracks. Instead of following the usual chain of command, players are stepping outside the traditional structure, grabbing attention and influencing the offseason narrative directly. This isn't about polished interviews or surface-level analysis. It's about the hard reality of professional sports, financial decisions, contract leverage, and the tough business side of the game. The chemistry that once defined this team now looks uncertain, and the unity fans believed in is being tested by real-world pressures. To understand how things reached this point, you have to look at the sequence of events. The WNBA offseason is highly strategic, where every public comment carries weight. Agents, executives, and rival teams analyze every word, and in the middle of all this, Caitlin Clark made a decisive move. She stepped in front of the media and made it clear, re-signing Kelsey Mitchell is the top priority. With her growing influence and visibility, that statement wasn't just casual, it carried serious weight. By publicly backing one player, she may have unintentionally shifted the internal balance, setting off a chain reaction that's now playing out across the entire organization.
Clark came out and said that Kelsey Mitchell is the top priority for the Indiana Fever in this free agency. And that left some questions in the air about, wait a minute, how much of a priority is Lexie Hall? How much of a priority?
Now listen closely to what's really embedded in that endorsement and why it matters. When a franchise cornerstone publicly identifies one player as the top priority, it sends an unmistakable message across the entire locker room. In a league governed by a hard salary cap, that kind of statement isn't just symbolic. It has real financial implications. It signals that a significant portion of the team's limited resources is already being mentally allocated. And once that signal is out there, the ripple effect is immediate. Every other player starts doing the math. They understand that in a capped system, committing heavily to one piece inevitably reduces flexibility elsewhere. It's not personal, it's structural, but that doesn't make the impact any less real inside a competitive locker room. For role players and defensive specialists like Lexie Hull and Sophie Cunningham, the situation becomes even more delicate. These are players who contribute in ways that don't always show up on the stat sheet. Perimeter defense, physicality, effort plays, and protecting their teammates in high-pressure moments. Their value is often tied to team chemistry and trust rather than headline numbers. However, the open market tends to evaluate things differently. Front offices have to prioritize durability, efficiency, and measurable production when making financial decisions. That's the difficult reality of roster building. Intangibles matter, but they don't always carry the same weight in contract negotiations. So when a public endorsement elevates one player above the rest, it can unintentionally create tension. Not because others aren't valuable, but because the system forces trade-offs. In that environment, even loyal, high-effort contributors can start to feel uncertain about where they stand. And that's where things get complicated, because while teams are built on chemistry and sacrifice, they're ultimately shaped by numbers, contracts, and long-term strategy.
With the Fever has ended, as she is now an unrestricted free agent ahead of her 8th season in the WNBA. And you also have to remember that Sophie Cunningham will likely be left unprotected in the expansion draft.
Now strip the emotion out of it and look at the situation the way a front office would. Sophie Cunningham put together a solid season, efficient scoring, perimeter shooting, and physical defensive presence. But in a hard-capped league, availability and long-term durability carry just as much weight as production. An MCL injury, especially one that cuts a season short, immediately complicates any long-term financial commitment. It doesn't erase her value, but it forces teams to reassess risk. From a roster building standpoint, the Indiana Fever are operating within strict limits. Protected slots, cap space, and future flexibility create a system where not everyone can be retained, no matter their contributions. When those constraints tighten, players coming off injuries, particularly unrestricted free agents, often find themselves in the most uncertain position. That doesn't necessarily mean the organization views her as expendable in a personal sense. It means the structure of the league forces difficult prioritization decisions. And once those decisions start becoming visible through public endorsements, contract focus, or silence on other players, it sends a message, whether intended or not. But this is where the dynamic shifts. Sophie Cunningham isn't just a role player operating in isolation. She understands the business side of the game, branding, visibility, and leverage. In today's sports landscape, a player's value isn't confined to on-court production alone. Marketability, fan engagement, and personal brand strength can all influence opportunities, both within and outside traditional team structures. So while the team may be calculating risk and cap allocation, she has the ability to reshape her own position, whether that's attracting interest from other teams, leveraging her profile, or creating new pathways that extend beyond a single franchise's decision. In other words, while the numbers may be tightening around her within one system, her overall leverage in the broader market doesn't necessarily disappear, it just evolves.
Declared after they introduced Hull as their special guest.
Our guest today is a professional basketball player, currently in the WNBA. She first made her name as a standout college athlete. Off the court, she's a fan favorite for her leadership and the way she represents the next generation of women's basketball.
Love that.
She's also a guard for the...
Take a step back and look at this without the dramatic framing, because what's happening is strategic, but not unusual or hostage-level chaos. What Sophie Cunningham is doing with her podcast presence is part of a much bigger shift in modern sports. Players owning their own media channels. By appearing on platforms like Show Me Something and tying content to high-traffic moments like March Madness, she's increasing visibility at exactly the right time. That's smart timing, not sabotage. Bringing Lexie Hull on as a guest also isn't inherently a power play against the Indiana Fever. It does create attention, and yes, it allows both players to speak more freely than they would in traditional media settings. But that's the nature of athlete-driven media today. Unfiltered, direct, and personal. We've seen this across leagues, where players use podcasts to shape their image, not necessarily to attack their teams. From a front office perspective, this kind of exposure can be a double-edged sword. On one hand, it removes some control over messaging. On the other hand, it can actually increase a player's market value and overall visibility, which benefits both the player and indirectly the league. It's also important to keep expectations grounded. General managers don't base contract offers on podcast appearances or public conversations. Decisions are still driven by performance data, medical evaluations, team fit, and salary cap constraints. A podcast might influence public perception, but it doesn't override the fundamentals of roster construction. So while this media activity amplifies their voices during free agency, it doesn't redefine the power structure entirely. It's better understood as leverage building in a modern sense, controlling narrative, staying relevant, and engaging fans, rather than a direct challenge to organizational authority. In short, it's a smart branding move happening at a sensitive time, but the real decisions will still be made where they always are, inside front offices, guided by numbers, strategy, and long-term planning.
How y'all feeling? I mean, the CBA is done. Okay, that was a long, tumultuous road. But what are you guys looking for in free agency is something I would like to know, and I'm hoping they address that. Are y'all looking for the money? Are y'all looking for, to stay where...
Now step back and analyze what's actually happening here, without the noise. Are Lexie Hull and Sophie Cunningham positioning themselves for the highest possible value in free agency? Yes, that's what every unrestricted free agent is supposed to do. This isn't rebellion, it's leverage. And in today's sports landscape, leverage doesn't just come from stats. It comes from visibility, timing, and narrative control. Their media activity, podcasts, and appearances aren't random. They're increasing attention during a critical window. That naturally strengthens their negotiating position, not because it forces a team's hand, but because it keeps them relevant in a crowded market. But here's where reality kicks in. The Indiana Fever cannot pay everyone. That's not strategy, that's math. If major money is allocated to cornerstone pieces like Kelsey Mitchell, the remaining cap space tightens quickly. Keeping multiple mid to high value role players becomes extremely difficult without sacrificing depth or flexibility. So the real question isn't whether Hull and Cunningham want maximum contracts. They do. The real question is how the market values them, and that's where things get nuanced. Yes, playing alongside a high profile star like Caitlin Clark increases visibility, opportunities, and exposure. That's undeniable, but it doesn't mean their value disappears outside of that system. Teams don't pay players based on proximity to star power. They pay for skill sets, fit, defense, shooting, and reliability. At the same time, front offices won't overextend just to preserve chemistry. Boss, the modern game is too cap sensitive for emotional decisions. If another team with more flexibility sees value, whether it's defense, toughness, or shooting, they can absolutely make a competitive offer. That's how free agency works.